You can't even imagine what people in the Wild West had to go through to survive the cold winters. Nights on the Great Plains where temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees and the nearest neighbor is several days away were a real test. There was no central heating, no modern insulation, not even enough firewood. There was only a house built of earth and grass and the knowledge that separated you from icy oblivion. This is not the scenario of a disaster movie, but the everyday reality for millions of settlers who explored the American frontier. Their struggle against the cold was a daily war, in which the main weapon was not a rifle, but ingenuity. They learned to turn simple, even primitive things into effective heating systems that seem like real miracles to us today. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how an ordinary stone from the hearth could keep a bed warm all night, and why cowboys preferred to sleep under a layer of snow rather than by the fire. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the pioneers, which you definitely did not know about. When we think of the frontier, we imagine log cabins, but there were almost no trees on the endless plains. Therefore, the main building material for the first settlers was the earth beneath their feet. Sod houses, or soddies, were not just cheap housing, but an ingenious engineering solution. The walls of such a house were laid out of layers of sod, like bricks, and the walls could be up to a meter thick. This earthen mass had incredible thermal inertia. During the day, the walls slowly absorbed heat from the sun and the hearth. At night, they slowly released this heat back into the house, maintaining a stable temperature. Even in the harshest frosts, it was significantly warmer inside the dugout than outside. The roof was also covered with turf, which served as an excellent insulator. In summer, such a roof protected from the heat, and in winter, from the cold. The only drawback was that sometimes grass grew through it. The interior walls were often covered with old newspapers or pages from catalogs. This was done not only for beauty, but also for additional insulation. Several layers of paper created an air gap that prevented drafts. The floors in such houses were earthen. They were carefully tamped down and sometimes moistened with water to make them as hard as concrete. Such a floor did not let the cold in from below, unlike the plank flooring in log houses. The windows were small and few in number to reduce heat loss. They were often covered with thick blankets or even old sacks. Every crack was an enemy that had to be neutralized. A sod house was a true ecosystem of survival. It was built from what was around and used the laws of physics to conserve precious heat. It was not just a house, but a living organism that breathed with its inhabitants. Many consider such dwellings primitive, but in fact, they were the height of adaptation. The settlers did not fight nature, but used its strengths. Their homes became an extension of the landscape, blending into it and protected by it. It is interesting to see how this topic is perceived in different parts of the world. Where are you from? Tell us in the comments what traditional methods your ancestors used to insulate their homes.
Sometimes the stories you remember.
Want to know a secret that will change your idea of comfort? In any frontier dwelling, whether it was a dugout or a log cabin, the center of the universe was the hearth or stove. It was not just a place for cooking, but the only source of heat, light, and life. Most early settlers built massive fireplaces out of wild stone and clay. The design of such a fireplace was critically important. A chimney that was too large drew all the heat outside, while one that was too small filled the room with smoke. The whole family's life was concentrated in one room, where the hearth was located. This is where they cooked, ate, worked, and slept. They tried to go to other unheated parts of the house as little as possible in winter. The constant need for fuel was a major concern. On the plains where firewood was scarce, anything that could burn was used. The main fuel was often dried bison dung, which the settlers called chips. Children and women spent hours collecting these chips on the prairie. They were piled up in large heaps near the house to last the whole winter. This fuel burned hot and almost smokeless, but required constant work to collect. Later, with the development of railroads, cast iron stoves began to be brought to the frontier. This was a real revolution. The stove was much more efficient than an open fireplace, consuming less fuel and giving off more heat into the room rather than up the chimney. The fire was not extinguished at night, but banked. The coals were covered with a thick layer of ash so that they would continue to smolder until morning. In the morning, it was enough to rake the ashes and throw in some fresh fuel to get the fire going again. The heat from the hearth was distributed unevenly. It was hot near the fire, but in the far corners of the room there could be frost. Therefore, people constantly changed places to warm up evenly. Caring for the hearth was a sacred duty. A fire that went out in the middle of a frosty night could be a serious problem. The well-being of the entire family depended on its warmth. The hearth was not only a source of heat, but also a social center. Stories were told, decisions were made, and people simply spent time together by the fire. It was a place that united the family in the face of harsh nature. The hearth was the heart of the home, but what did people do when they left its walls? In the next chapter, you will learn how mountain trappers survived in the icy mountains with only an axe and a blanket. What I am about to show you seems impossible, but it is the absolute truth. Mountain hunters or trappers spent their winters far from any settlements in the harshest conditions of the Rocky Mountains. They had no homes, and their heating methods were the epitome of minimalism and efficiency. Their main shelter was not a hut, but a properly organized fire. A trapper never lit a fire just like that, in an open place. He always built a heat reflector, or noddy. To do this, 2 stakes were driven into the ground on one side of the fire, between which a wall of logs was laid. This wall prevented the heat from dissipating and reflected it toward the sleeping person. This created a comfortable area, protected from the wind. The trapper himself would lie down to sleep between the fire and this wall. He would lie on a thick layer of fir branches, which insulated him from the frozen ground. He covered himself with a heavy bison skin. This system allowed him to sleep outdoors even in severe frost. The heat reflected from the wall warmed one side of his body, while the skin retained heat on the other. At night, he had to wake up several times to throw wood on the fire. If it snowed, trappers used it as a building material. They could dig a snow cave in a deep snowdrift or build a simple quin's shelter. Snow, oddly enough, is an excellent insulator. Inside a snow shelter, body heat could keep the temperature around 0 degrees, even if it was freezing outside. A small candle or oil lamp could raise the temperature even more. Trappers knew that the most important thing was protection from the wind. They also used hot stones. Several stones were heated in a fire, then wrapped in a piece of skin and placed under the blanket. Such an improvised heating pad lasted for several hours. A trapper's clothing was his second skin and main source of warmth. It consisted of several layers and was made of leather and fur. Such clothing not only kept him warm, but also breathed, wicking moisture away from the body. Their survival methods were the result of hundreds of years of experience learned from indigenous peoples. They did not try to create home comforts in the middle of the wilderness. Their goal was simply to maintain vital functions with minimal energy expenditure. Are you ready for the shocking truth about old houses? The settlers' main enemy in winter was not so much the cold as the wind. The piercing wind of the Great Plains could blow all the heat out of a house in minutes, turning it into an icy trap. The battle against drafts was endless. The main weak point of log cabins was the gaps between the logs. They had to be carefully caulked or chinked. To do this, the gaps were filled with whatever was at hand. Moss was considered the ideal material, as it expanded when wet and tightly sealed all the voids. But more often, a mixture of clay, grass, and even manure was used. This procedure had to be repeated every fall. Over the summer, the house breathed, the logs dried out, and new gaps appeared. Sealing the house was as important a ritual in preparation for winter as gathering firewood. Doors and windows were a separate problem. Their frames were rarely perfectly fitted. They were sealed around the perimeter with strips of fabric, old clothes, or felt. At night, the windows were additionally covered with heavy blankets or even carpets. This created an additional insulating layer that significantly reduced heat loss. Every calorie of heat counted, A special fabric roll stuffed with sand or rags was often placed under the door. This sausage dog, as it was called, prevented cold air from seeping under the door. This simple invention can still be found in some homes today. The chimney was also a source of drafts. When the fireplace was not in use, the damper was closed tightly, and sometimes the pipe was even plugged with an old sack. The main thing was not to forget to remove it before lighting the fire again. This whole system required constant attention. The settler constantly inspected his house, looking for new cracks and immediately repairing them. It was a real battle to keep the heat in. How do you think modern people, accustomed to comfort, would be able to survive in such conditions? In the next chapter, you will learn how clothing became a personal heating system. There was no fashion on the frontier, only functionality. Properly selected clothing was as important to survival as a warm home. The main principle was layering. The bottom layer of clothing had to wick moisture away from the body. Cotton or linen underwear was used for this purpose. Clothes wet with sweat in the cold were a direct path to hypothermia. The middle layer was responsible for thermal insulation. Wool reigned supreme here. Woolen shirts, pants, and sweaters retained heat well, even when wet. The outer layer protected against wind and moisture. Cowboys and trappers wore jackets and pants made of thick, tanned leather or oiled fabric. These materials were windproof and water repellent. Headwear was of great importance. A person loses a significant amount of heat through their head. Therefore, fur or wool hats were an essential part of winter clothing. Hands were protected with fur or leather mittens. Unlike gloves, mittens keep the fingers together so they can warm each other. This simple rule saved many hands from frostbite. Footwear was a weak point. Leather boots quickly got wet and froze. Therefore, thick woolen socks or foot cloths were placed inside the boots, as well as felt or grass insoles. Many settlers adopted the practices of the Native Americans and wore moccasins. Winter moccasins were taller than usual and lined with fur. Their advantage was that they were soft and did not interfere with blood circulation in the feet. Clothes were not taken off at night, but only loosened. People slept in several layers of clothing to retain body heat. It was unwise to take off warm clothes in a cold house. All clothing was durable and repairable. Any holes were immediately sewn up with patches. Throwing away a good woolen shirt because of a small tear was unthinkable wastefulness. What if I told you that the bed was the warmest place in the whole house? After sunset, when the temperature dropped sharply and the fire in the hearth began to die down, the only place of refuge was the bed. Preparing it was a whole ritual. The base of the bed was a mattress stuffed with straw, dry leaves, or corn husks. It was thick and provided good insulation from the cold air rising from the floor. Wealthier families could afford feather beds stuffed with goose down. Several layers of blankets were spread on top of the mattress. The most valuable were quilted blankets, or quilts. Women sewed them from hundreds of small pieces of fabric, and air pockets formed between the layers of fabric, which retained heat very well. But even the warmest blankets could not warm an icy bed. Therefore, it had to be warmed up before going to bed. For this purpose, a special device was used, a coal pan or bed warmer. It was a metal pan with a long handle and a lid with holes. Hot coals from the hearth were placed inside. The lid was closed and the device was moved between the sheets. The bed became warm and cozy. A simpler method was to use heated stones or bricks. They were heated by the fire, wrapped in thick cloth so as not to burn the sheets, and placed at the feet. Such warmers lasted for most of the night. Several people often slept in one bed. This was done not only because of lack of space, but also for warmth. The heat of human bodies helped to keep each other warm throughout the night. Beds often had a canopy, curtains made of thick fabric on all four sides. At night, the canopy was drawn, creating a small enclosed space. The air inside was warmed by people's breath and remained warm until morning. Sometimes beds were built in the form of boxes or cabinets built into the wall. Such an alcove bed was even more protected from drafts. It was a real sleeping fortress. Which of these ancient methods do you find most ingenious? In the next chapter, we will talk about how the cooking process itself became part of the heating system. The process of cooking on the frontier was inextricably linked to heating the home. The kitchen hearth or stove worked from morning to night, and this heat was not wasted. It was an important contribution to the overall temperature balance of the home. In winter, housewives tried to cook dishes that required long simmering. A large pot of soup or stew could simmer for hours on low heat. This not only made tough meat tender, but also constantly radiated heat and moist steam. Baking bread turned the kitchen into the warmest place in the house. The oven was heated to a high temperature and remained hot for a long time. The smell of fresh bread mixed with a feeling of comfort and warmth. Boiling water for washing or cleaning was also part of the heating process. Huge water tanks were heated on the stove and worked like large radiators. The hot steam humidified the dry winter air, making it more comfortable to breathe. Even the hot water left over after washing the dishes was not poured out immediately. It was left to cool in a basin so that it would give off its remaining heat into the room. Every calorie counted. The location of the kitchen stove was strategic. It was often placed so that it heated the central part of the house. The heat from it spread throughout the living space. In summer, on the contrary, people tried to cook outside, in summer kitchens or on open hearths. This was done so as not to overheat the house. In winter, all cooking activities moved indoors. A working stove was a symbol of life and prosperity. As long as it was hot, the house was warm and there was food. Its warmth gathered the whole family around it. Thus, the kitchen was not just a place for cooking. It was the heart of the heating system. The energy spent on cooking served a dual purpose. This principle of dual use of energy was the basis of survival. Nothing should be wasted. The heat from cooking was as important a product as the food itself.
Indeed it will.
In frontier conditions, survival alone was virtually impossible, especially in winter. Social ties and mutual assistance were as important a source of warmth as the fire in the hearth. Neighbors, even those living several miles apart, were the main source of support. The winter months were a time of relative lull in agricultural work. This time was used for joint activities. Men could go together to gather firewood, helping each other to fell large trees. Women gathered for quilting bees where they sewed quilts together. While they worked, they shared news, advice, and simply supported each other. As a result, not only were warm quilts created, but social bonds were also strengthened. If one family had a problem, for example, they ran out of firewood or food, their neighbors always came to their aid. Refusing to help meant not only showing callousness, but also jeopardizing one's own future. Help today, and tomorrow you will be helped. The church or school was often the only public building in the area. On Sundays, everyone gathered for a service held in a heated room. It was an opportunity not only to fulfill their religious duty, but also to simply stay warm and socialize with people. Holidays, such as Christmas, were celebrated by the entire community. They organized communal dinners, dances, and games. These events dispelled the gloom and despondency of the long winter and gave people an emotional boost. Working together also helped to keep warm in a literal sense. Clearing snow from the road or building a new barn required physical effort. People working together kept warm through movement and camaraderie. Isolation was one of the main challenges of winter. The opportunity to talk to someone other than family members was invaluable. Simple human interaction helped combat depression and loneliness. Thus, the warmth of the community was an invisible force that helped people survive the winter. People warmed each other not only physically, but also morally. They created social warmth that was no less important than the warmth from the fire. It was a system of collective security. The strength of the community was that it could cope with problems that were too much for one family to handle alone. Together, they were stronger than the cold. The constant need for fuel forced settlers to show remarkable ingenuity. When firewood and bison dung ran out, the most unexpected things were used. The ability to find or create fuel from nothing was a key skill. One such alternative fuel was corn cobs. After the harvest, mountains of cobs remained, which burned very well. They provided a quick and hot fire, ideal for cooking. Some farmers pressed straw or dry grass into dense briquettes. These briquettes burned slower than just straw and gave off more heat. There were even hand presses for making these fuel blocks. In some regions, settlers discovered coal deposits on the surface. They could simply collect coal or dig shallow pits. Such found coal was a real gift as it burned much longer and hotter than firewood. Residents of coastal areas used driftwood, wood washed ashore by the sea, as fuel. This wood had to be dried for a long time, as it was saturated with salt. But in treeless areas, it was the only source of wood. Animal fat was also a valuable source of energy. It was not only used for food, but also burned in oil lamps. Such a lamp provided not only light, but also a little heat. Sunflowers were grown not only for their seeds. Dry sunflower stems in baskets were excellent fuel. They burned quickly but gave off a lot of heat. Even old furniture or broken tools could be thrown into the furnace in desperate situations. Any combustible material was considered potential fuel. Nothing was wasted. Perhaps the most exotic type of fuel was peat. In marshy areas, it was cut into bricks and dried in the sun. Peat burned slowly and smokily, but provided stable heat. This ingenuity shows how acute the problem of heating was. The settlers could not afford to be picky. They learned to extract heat from everything around them. This ability to adapt and find unconventional solutions was the key to their survival. They saw potential where modern man would see only rubbish. The struggle against the cold was not only a physical, but also a psychological challenge. The long, dark, and cold winter put enormous pressure on people's mental health. The ability to maintain a cheerful spirit was no less important than the ability to build a fire. One way to combat despondency was routine. A clear daily schedule, where every hour was occupied with some kind of work, left no time for gloomy thoughts. Preparing firewood, caring for livestock, repairing tools, handicrafts, constant activity was the best cure for depression. Light was a symbol of hope in life. Even a simple tallow candle or oil lamp burning on long winter evenings created a feeling of comfort. It dispelled not only physical darkness, but also mental darkness. Books and reading were a salvation for many. The opportunity to immerse oneself in another world, in a story full of adventure and warmth, helped to distract from the harsh reality. The Bible and mail-order catalogs were the most popular books on the frontier. Music and singing also played an important role. A simple violin or harmonica could bring the whole family together. Singing together helped to create a sense of unity and lift the spirits. Planning for the future was a powerful psychological tool. In winter, farmers planned their spring planting and dreamed of the future harvest. These thoughts of coming warmth and abundance gave them the strength to endure the difficult present. Women found solace in needlework. Creating beautiful things, embroidery or quilted blankets, was an act of creation in the midst of a world that seemed to have frozen. Each stitch was a small victory over chaos. Humor was a defense mechanism. The ability to laugh at difficulties, at oneself, at absurd everyday situations helped to relieve tension. Jokes and stories told by the hearth warmed people as well as the fire itself. People learned to appreciate small joys. A sunny day in the middle of a cloudy week, hot soup after working in the cold, a quiet evening with the family. The ability to find happiness in simple things was the basis of psychological resilience. Thus, survival in winter was a complex task. It required not only a warm home and a supply of firewood, but also a strong spirit. Psychological toughness was invisible armor that protected the settlers from the most terrible cold, the cold of despair. We see that life on the frontier was a constant demonstration of human ingenuity. In the absence of the technologies we are accustomed to, the settlers created their own unique system of comfort. It was based on a deep understanding of nature, the rational use of resources, and the strength of the community. Every element of their daily life, from earthen houses to quilted blankets, was part of a well-thought-out survival strategy. They did not simply fight the cold, they learned to live in harmony with it, using its own laws to their advantage. This story is not about deprivation, but about the incredible power of the human spirit and mind. Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. Perhaps you are interested in how they built their homes without modern tools, or how they obtained water in the arid prairies. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new explorations of the mysteries of the American frontier.